Welcome, and settle in, because tonight we're going to explore one of the strangest and most quietly profound stories that the world of Spider-Man has ever told. It is a story about a villain who put on a hero's mask and discovered slowly and against every instinct he possessed that the mask had weight he had not anticipated. It is a story about identity and conscience, about what remains of a person when everything else has been stripped away, and about the unexpected places where genuine heroism can take root. There is no need to hold anything tightly tonight. Let the story come to you at its own pace, carrying you gently through the streets of New York and into the complicated, melancholy, and ultimately very human interior of a man who wanted to be superior and learned, at considerable cost, what that word truly means. Tonight, we ask a question that has no easy answer. Can a villain become a hero? And if he can, what does that transformation cost, and what does it leave behind? Let the city settle around you. Let the lights of Manhattan dim at the edges of your awareness. The story is already unfolding slowly and without urgency. And there is nowhere you need to be but here. To understand what happened when Otto Octavius became Spider-Man, it is necessary first to understand the long road that made such a thing possible, and that road begins not in a laboratory or a prison cell or a villain's lair, but in a modest house in Brookhaven, Long Island, where a boy with an extraordinary mind grew up in circumstances that taught him all the wrong lessons about what intelligence was for. Otto Octavius was born in the middle of the 20th century to parents whose marriage was less a partnership than a permanent negotiation of grievances. His father, Torbert Octavius, was a labourer, a man whose hands were calloused from physical work, and whose relationship with his own limitations expressed itself as resentment toward anyone who seemed unburdened by those same limitations. His mother, Mary Lavinia, was a woman of fierce ambition that had found no outlet in her own life, and had transferred itself entirely onto her son, wrapping her hopes around him with a pressure that was indistinguishable, in her mind, from love. Between these two forces, Otto grew up understanding that his intelligence was simultaneously his greatest asset, and a source of tension that could never quite be resolved, that being smarter than the people around him was something to be both cultivated and careful about, and that the world was divided into those who recognized genius and those who feared it. He was, by any objective measure, a remarkable student. His facility with mathematics and chemistry became apparent early, the kind of early that draws the attention of teachers who have spent careers waiting to encounter it. He could hold complex equations in his mind the way other children held songs, turning them over, examining them from multiple angles, finding in their internal logic a kind of beauty that he could not have explained to anyone who did not already understand it. School was the one environment in which Otto felt genuinely at ease, where the rules were clear and the measures of success were objective, where it was possible to be unambiguously correct in a way that daily life never permitted. But ease in the classroom did not translate to ease anywhere else. Otto was not a child who made friends naturally. He lacked the social fluency that allows children to navigate the complex unspoken negotiations of playground hierarchy, and his tendency to correct others, to point out errors with a precision that was technically accurate but socially devastating, made him a figure who was admired from a distance and avoided up close. He was the boy other students copied homework from rather than the boy they invited to birthday parties, and while he told himself that this arrangement suited him perfectly well, that he had no need of the shallow companionship that lesser minds seemed to require, the loneliness of his adolescence left marks on his character that no amount of academic achievement could fully cover. His mother's influence during these years was profound and, in the way of certain profound influences, profoundly damaging. She loved Otto in the way that some people love things they have decided to own rather than know, with an intensity that contained very little genuine curiosity about who he actually was, and a great deal of investment in who she had decided he would become. She told him repeatedly that he was better than the people around him, that his intelligence set him apart in ways that ordinary people would never appreciate, that he should never allow anyone to diminish him or cause him to doubt the exceptionality that she could see so clearly, and that the world was simply too limited to recognize. These lessons landed in the rich soil of a lonely child's heart, and grew into something that would take decades to either flower or poison, depending on the choices that came later. His father's resentment provided the counterweight. Torbert Octavius had not gone to university and did not believe that education made a man. He expressed this belief with the particular cruelty that comes from a person who suspects, in their most honest private moments, that they might have been capable of more than circumstances allowed, and who has decided that the most manageable response to that suspicion is contempt for those who had different circumstances. He called Otto soft. He called his scientific interests useless. He died when Otto was a young man, and Otto grieved for him with a complicated grief that contained more anger than sorrow. The grief of someone who had wanted something from a person and understood only after they were gone that the wanting itself had been the injury all along. Otto went to university on scholarship, and the experience confirmed everything he had come to believe about himself and the world. He was extraordinary in his field, producing research in atomic physics and nuclear engineering that drew serious attention from serious people, landing him positions at government facilities and eventually at a private research company, where the equipment was excellent and the funding was substantial, and the expectations were high enough that even Otto felt genuinely challenged. For a period in his late 20s and early 30s, he was happy, or something close to it, in the way that a person can be happy when the external architecture of their life finally matches the internal sense of what they deserve. He designed a set of mechanical arms during this period, a harness of 4 titanium appendages controlled by a direct neural interface that allowed him to manipulate radioactive materials at a safe distance. The arms were a marvel of engineering, responsive and precise. An extension of his body that amplified everything he was already capable of and gave him a physical presence that his unremarkable body had never provided on its own. He wore them in the laboratory as other men wore reading glasses, with the casual ease of something that had simply become part of how he moved through the world. The accident, when it came, was the result of negligence compounded by overconfidence, which is to say it was exactly the kind of accident that tends to happen to people who believe their expertise makes them invulnerable to ordinary mishaps. An explosive accident in the laboratory exposed Otto to an intense burst of radiation that fused the mechanical arms permanently to his body, altered the neural pathways between his mind and the harness in ways that no one had thought possible, and introduced a cocktail of radioactive compounds into his bloodstream that would affect his brain chemistry in ways that would take months to become fully apparent. In the aftermath, the man who had been Otto Octavius remained in all the ways that were measurable and quite possibly in most of the ways that mattered. But something had shifted beneath the architecture of his personality, the way a house can shift on its foundation after an earthquake, still standing, still recognizably itself, but no longer quite level. The inhibitions that had previously restrained his worst impulses, the social calculations that had kept his arrogance functional rather than catastrophic, the residual fear of consequences that had governed his behavior in professional settings, these things were diminished or altered in ways that allowed what had always been present in Otto Octavius to express itself without the filtration that civilization requires. He became, over the months following the accident, the person that the lonely and resentful and brilliant boy from Brookhaven had perhaps always been moving toward becoming. He became someone who believed, with a clarity that felt to him like liberation, that his intelligence entitled him to take what he wanted from a world that had always undervalued him. He became someone who used his mechanical arms not as laboratory tools but as weapons, as the physical expression of a superiority that he had always possessed but that the world had always been too limited to properly acknowledge. He became Dr. Octopus, and in becoming Dr. Octopus he felt, for the first time in his life, entirely free. The criminal career that followed was characterized by a particular quality that distinguished it from the ambitions of most of his contemporaries in New York's unusual population of costumed antagonists. Otto did not primarily want money, though he took it readily enough. He did not want power in the political sense, did not dream of ruling cities or countries in the way that some of his fellow villains seemed to. What Otto wanted, at the deepest and most honest level of his wanting, was to be recognized. He wanted the world to understand, with the same clarity that he himself possessed, that he was the most capable and most dangerous intellect it had produced. Every crime was, at its root, a demonstration. Every scheme was an argument. Every confrontation with law enforcement or heroes was, beneath the violence, a test administered by a man who needed to see whether anyone out there was capable of understanding the question. It was in this context that Spider-Man entered his life, and it would be difficult to overstate the significance of that entrance, and everything that followed from it. Spider-Man was young and physically gifted and possessed of a quickness, both physical and verbal, that Otto found maddening in the way that one finds maddening only the things that threaten something genuinely important. Here was a hero who met him as an intellectual equal in tactical terms, who refused to be intimidated, who answered his gravest threats with jokes, who defeated him not through superior power, but through a combination of resourcefulness and a moral stubbornness that Otto could not dismiss or co-opt. He could not buy Spider-Man. He could not frighten him into retreat. He could not convince him that the rational thing to do was to acknowledge Otto's superiority and step aside. Spider-Man kept coming back, kept finding ways to win, kept meeting every demonstration of Otto's genius with a response that suggested the demonstration had not been quite as conclusive as Otto had intended. He hated Spider-Man the way one hates a mirror that shows a face you are not expecting to see, with a fury that contained, buried very deep and very well protected, something uncomfortably close to recognition. And so the decades passed, and the war between them became the organizing fact of both their lives, and neither of them understood yet what that war was really about, or where it would eventually lead them both. The war that defined both of them did not begin with a single dramatic confrontation, so much as accumulate across years and decades like sediment at the bottom of a river, each encounter adding its own layer to something that grew denser and more complex with time, until the history between Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus had become one of the longest and most psychologically intricate rivalries that New York City had ever witnessed between a hero and the villain who seemed, in some fundamental way, made specifically to oppose him. Their first meeting occurred in the early years of Spider-Man's career, when Peter Parker was still a teenager navigating the steep learning curve of heroism with more determination than experience, and Otto Octavius had already established himself as one of the most dangerous and unpredictable criminal minds the city had encountered. The young hero who swung into that initial confrontation full of confidence and quipping wit was genuinely unprepared for what he found. Otto's mechanical arms were unlike anything Peter had faced, possessing a reach and a strength and a versatility that neutralized most of the advantages that Spider-Man's agility and web shooting normally provided, and the man controlling those arms fought with a cold efficiency that suggested he had thought carefully about how to handle a wall-crawling opponent before their encounter began. Peter lost that first battle decisively, and the defeat shook him in the particular way that early. Comprehensive losses can shake a young person who has begun to believe in their own capabilities, raising questions about whether those capabilities were actually sufficient for the life he had chosen. But Peter Parker had never been someone who allowed a defeat to become a definition, and he came back, as he always came back, having thought carefully about what had gone wrong and what needed to change, and the second encounter told a different story. This was the pattern that would repeat itself across the decades with a consistency that eventually took on almost a ceremonial quality, Otto winning or coming terrifyingly close to winning, Peter finding the reserves of will and creativity to overcome, Otto retreating to recalibrate, the cycle beginning again. It was a pattern that frustrated Otto enormously, and that Peter found exhausting in a way he rarely allowed himself to fully acknowledge, because the honest acknowledgement of that exhaustion would have required him to sit with the uncomfortable truth that no matter how many times he defeated Dr. Octopus always returned. There was a moment in the middle period of their long conflict that became, over time, one of the stories most often told about what Spider-Man truly was beneath the costume and the jokes. It occurred during a period when Peter had temporarily lost his powers, when the Spider-Bite's gifts had receded and left him with nothing but his ordinary human body, and the will that had always been the less celebrated but arguably more important of his two most significant assets. Dr. Octopus had presented himself as essentially unstoppable under these circumstances, and the logical, rational, objectively correct assessment of the situation was that a powerless Peter Parker had no business attempting to fight him. Every tactical calculation pointed toward retreat. Every reasonable measure of the gap between them suggested that the outcome of a confrontation would be swift and painful, and entirely one-sided. Peter fought him anyway. He fought him with the stubborn, almost irrational determination of someone who has decided that the question of whether he can win is less important than the question of whether he is willing to quit, and he took a great deal of punishment in the process, and he did not quit, and Otto found himself in the strange position of looking at a young man with no powers who refused to stop getting up, and something in that refusal worked on him in ways he could not immediately name. He did not respect weakness. He had never respected weakness. But what he was looking at was not weakness, and he understood that even as he denied it, and the understanding lodged itself somewhere in him and stayed there, changing nothing visible and everything that would eventually matter. The Sinister Six brought a different dimension to the history between them, because it was in that context that Otto demonstrated his understanding of Spider-Man not merely as an opponent to be defeated, but as a problem to be solved with sufficient planning and adequate resources. The assembling of a team of Spider-Man's most capable enemies, each with their own grievances and their own abilities, each assigned a specific role in a sequential assault designed to wear the hero down by degrees, was the work of a genuinely strategic mind. Electro and Kraven and Mysterio and Sandman and Vulture were not gathered casually. They were selected and deployed with the precision of a general who has studied his enemy's strengths and constructed a campaign designed to neutralize them one by one. That it did not work, that Peter found ways to overcome each encounter despite the accumulated toll they took on his body and his reserves, was a testament to something that Otto's planning had accounted for in theory but could not quite accommodate in practice. The way that Peter Parker's moral commitment functioned as a kind of fuel that did not deplete the way physical strength depleted, that seemed instead to become more concentrated under pressure, burning hotter the more the situation demanded of it. Otto could plan against Spider-Man's agility and his web shooters and his spider sense. He could not plan against the specific quality of stubbornness that came from someone who fought not for victory, but because the alternative to fighting was living with having stopped. The years accumulated their specific textures and memories. There was the period when Otto came closest to a kind of domestic normalcy, his brief and strange relationship with Aunt May, entering the history between them as one of its most surreal chapters, a time when Peter found himself in the genuinely extraordinary position of potentially having the man he considered one of his most dangerous enemies become his uncle by marriage. That this did not come to pass was partly a matter of circumstance, and partly a matter of May Parker's own eventual clarity about the man she'd been drawn to, but the episode illuminated something about Otto that the battlefield did not. That beneath the megalomania and the violence and the comprehensive need to be recognized as superior, there was a person who wanted ordinary things, who wanted to be cared for and valued and seen as more than a collection of dangerous capabilities. He had simply never found a way to pursue those ordinary things that did not eventually express itself as threat or control, or the particular loneliness of someone who does not know how to be in a room with another person without the room eventually feeling like a laboratory where he is the only scientist. There were encounters scattered across the years that seemed, in retrospect, to be teaching both of them things they were not yet ready to consciously learn. There was the long period during which Otto operated through proxies and intermediaries, when his physical condition had deteriorated sufficiently that direct confrontation was no longer practical, and he was forced to exercise his formidable intelligence through other people, an arrangement that revealed both his adaptability and the extent to which his identity had become dependent on being the most capable presence in any given situation. There were the intervals of imprisonment, during which Otto used the time to plan with a methodical patience that his enemies consistently underestimated, emerging each time with schemes more elaborate and more carefully constructed than the ones that had preceded them. And there was Spider-Man, persistent and principled and maddening, showing up every time with the same combination of physical resourcefulness and moral refusal that had characterized their very first encounter, changed in the ways that years and losses and accumulated experience change a person, but recognizable at the core as the same person who had gotten back up after that first defeat and come back better prepared, the same person who had fought without powers because the alternative was not fighting, the same person who made jokes in the middle of battles that Otto found simultaneously contemptible and, in his most honest private moments, rather impressive. What Otto could not have articulated across all those years was that Spider-Man had become the primary relationship of his life in a way that went beyond enmity. The villain who had been defined by his need for recognition had found, in his conflict with Peter Parker, the only ongoing engagement in his existence that felt genuinely reciprocal. Spider-Man knew him. Not fully, not in the ways that would have been possible if the relationship had been different, but in the ways that come from long familiarity with an opponent's tactics and psychology and limits Spider-Man had accumulated a knowledge of Otto Octavius that no one else possessed. Every victory Otto had achieved against him meant something, because Spider-Man was the one it had been achieved against. Every defeat stung as deeply as it did because Spider-Man was the one who had administered it. He would never have said this. He would have rejected the framing with contempt and produced a more dignified account of their relationship in which he was a superior intellect temporarily inconvenienced by a persistent nuisance. But the truth, the one that his body was already beginning to force him toward as his health declined and the long account of his life came due, was that the web-slinger who had defeated him so many times was the person who had known him longest and most honestly, and that the story of Otto Octavius could not be told without him. That understanding was still forming, still working its way toward the surface of his awareness, on the day that Otto Octavius received the news that would change everything and begin the strangest chapter either of them would ever live through. The news, when it came, arrived not with the drama that might have been expected for a man of Otto Octavius's temperament and history, but with the quiet, clinical precision of a physician reading numbers from a page, numbers that had been converted into words only because words were what the situation required, and the words were simple and clear and left very little room for the kind of argument that Otto had spent his entire life using as a primary mode of engagement with reality. His body was failing. Not in the gradual, manageable way that bodies fail when they age through ordinary circumstances, but in the accelerated, comprehensive way that bodies fail when they have been asked to absorb decades of radiation exposure and physical trauma, and the particular cellular damage that comes from having 4 mechanical arms fused permanently to one's nervous system and drawing on the body's own electrical and chemical resources every moment of every day for years beyond counting. The doctors who delivered this information did so with the careful professional neutrality that physicians learn to maintain when the news they are carrying has no ameliorating dimension, when there is no treatment to recommend and no timeline to soften and no version of the truth that is less true than any other version. Otto's organs were deteriorating with a rapidity that suggested the process had been underway for longer than any of them had recognized, progressing beneath the surface of his other, more visible health concerns like a slow fire in the walls of a building that appears from the outside entirely intact. His cardiovascular system was compromised. His neurological function, while still extraordinary in its higher registers, showed damage in the regions responsible for physical coordination and autonomic regulation. His kidneys were operating at a fraction of their designed capacity. The mechanical arms, which had become so thoroughly integrated into his physiology that removing them would have been as dangerous as leaving them, continued to draw on biological reserves that were no longer adequate to sustain that demand. He was, the doctors told him with as much gentleness as the facts permitted, looking at months rather than years. Otto received this information in the way that a man receives information that he has, on some level, already known for some time without allowing himself to fully acknowledge the knowing. There was no collapse, no visible devastation, none of the emotional responses that the delivering physician had perhaps prepared herself to manage. He sat very still in the examination room with the mechanical arms arranged around him, with the quiet, settled quality they had when he was not agitated, and he looked at the reports she had placed before him with the focused attention of someone reading a particularly dense piece of scientific literature, working through the implications methodically, following the data where it led. Then he thanked her with a courtesy that she would later describe as the most unsettling part of the entire conversation. And he left. What happened in the privacy of his own mind during the days that followed that appointment was something that Otto allowed no one to witness, and that he himself processed in the particular way of people who have spent their lives converting emotional experience into intellectual problem, rather than permitting the emotional experience to simply be what it is. He was angry in the deep and foundational way that a person can be angry when they believe that the universe owes them something it has declined to pay. He had been extraordinary. He had demonstrated his genius repeatedly and comprehensively across decades of work, both legitimate and otherwise. He had built things and broken things and left his mark on the world in ways that most people, most ordinary limited people, could not have imagined achieving. And now his body, the vessel that housed all of that exceptional capability, was simply stopping. Wearing out like a machine that had been run too hard for too long without adequate maintenance, and the universe appeared entirely indifferent to the injustice of this. Beneath the anger, carefully managed and rarely permitted to surface in any form he would have recognized as vulnerability, was something else. It was the fear that belongs specifically to the recognition of meaninglessness, the fear that arrives when a person looks honestly at the account of their life and asks what it has amounted to, not in the terms they have always used to measure it, not in victories achieved or enemies defeated, or demonstrations of superiority delivered to an insufficiently appreciative world, but in the deeper terms that mortality forces on even the most offended of minds. What had he built that would remain? What had he given to anyone that had not been extracted through threat or taken by force? What would be different in the world after he was gone? And would any of that difference be something he would want to claim? These were questions that Otto would not have tolerated in ordinary circumstances, would have dismissed as the sentimental indulgences of minds too weak to sustain themselves without the comfort of legacy and meaning. But the circumstances were no longer ordinary, and the body that had always been the engine of his ambitions was now the source of a constant, escalating physical discomfort that made the maintenance of his usual defences considerably more difficult. Pain has a way of stripping away the elaborate structures that people construct to avoid knowing what they actually feel, and Otto was in a great deal of pain, more than he acknowledged to anyone, more than the medications he was obtaining through channels that did not require him to explain his situation could adequately manage. The mechanical arms had become something different during this period. They had always been extensions of himself, responsive to his neural commands with a precision that had, over the decades, come to feel as natural as the movement of his own hands. But as his physical condition deteriorated, they became something more than extensions. They became supports, necessary in ways that went beyond their original design, compensating for the instabilities in his gait and balance that the neurological damage was creating, providing a structural framework that his failing body could lean against in moments when it would otherwise have been unable to maintain its dignity. He was aware of this shift, and he hated it with the specific hatred that a proud person reserves for the evidence of their own dependence, but he could not change it any more than he could change the numbers in the medical reports, and so he carried the hatred alongside everything else, one more weight in an increasingly heavy load. It was during this period of physical decline and enforced self-examination that the plan began to form, and it is important to understand that the plan did not arrive fully constructed, the way that Otto's more elaborate criminal schemes had sometimes seemed to appear, already detailed and ready for execution. It grew gradually, the way that certain ideas grow in minds that are working on multiple levels simultaneously, with the conscious layer occupied by more immediate concerns, while something deeper and more patient assembles the architecture of something genuinely new. He had knowledge of consciousness transfer that was more advanced than anything in the public scientific literature, research he had conducted during one of his periods of incarceration when the prison's laboratory facilities had been, somewhat inexplicably, more generous than was perhaps advisable. He had theories about the mechanics of neural pattern encoding that he had never published and that no one else in the world had yet reached independently. He had, in short, the conceptual foundation for something that most scientists would have dismissed as science fiction, and he had the motivation that transforms conceptual foundations into operational plans. The question of whose body he would use was one that presented itself with a clarity that surprised him by how long it took to fully acknowledge. He had considered other options, had surveyed the landscape of available candidates with the methodical attention that any serious planning required, and he had found himself returning, again and again, to the same answer that some part of him had known from the beginning. Peter Parker's body was young and healthy, and possessed of a physical resilience that went far beyond the ordinary, an enhanced physiology that would accommodate Otto's demanding and brilliant mind with a durability that no ordinary human body could have provided. These were the practical reasons, and they were real, and they mattered to the part of Otto's mind that preferred to operate in the currency of practical reasons. But there were other reasons, ones that the practical framing could not entirely contain, reasons rooted in the long history between them and the particular shape that history had given to Otto's sense of himself and his sense of his enemy. Peter Parker had defeated him repeatedly across decades, in ways both physical and moral, had stood in front of him without powers and refused to yield, and had made that refusal mean something that Otto could not dismiss no matter how many alternative explanations he constructed. To inhabit Peter Parker's body was not merely to survive. It was to take from the one person who had consistently proven himself difficult to defeat the very life through which that difficulty had been expressed. It was the ultimate demonstration, the final proof of superiority, the argument that would end the argument. He understood, in the quieter moments that his illness increasingly forced upon him, that this reasoning was not entirely rational, that it contained within it the old, deep hunger for recognition that his mother had planted in him decades ago, and that had shaped every significant decision of his life since. He understood it, and he proceeded anyway, because understanding one's motivations has never been the same thing as being free of them, and because the alternative was lying in a failing body in a room somewhere, becoming less and less himself by degrees, until there was nothing left of Otto Octavius but the medical reports, and the memories of the people who had defeated him, and the silence that followed an exceptional life that had somehow, in the end, amounted to less than it should have. He was not willing to accept that silence. Not yet. Not while there was still something he could do. The plan that Otto had assembled across those months of physical decline and enforced self-examination was, by any measure, the most technically ambitious thing he had ever attempted. Which was a considerable statement for a man whose career had included schemes of genuinely extraordinary complexity. The consciousness transfer technology he had developed was not something that could be adequately described in the terms that most people use to discuss such things, not the science fiction vocabulary of brain scanning and digital uploading that had become commonplace in popular imagination, but something more fundamental and more strange, rooted in his understanding of the neural interface that had existed between himself and the mechanical arms for decades, an interface that had, over those years of continuous operation, mapped the patterns of his mind with a completeness that no external instrument could have achieved. He had been, in a sense, documenting himself without knowing it, and the documentation was thorough enough to serve the purpose he now required of it. The execution of the plan required proximity, and proximity required a confrontation. And the confrontation was arranged in the way that confrontations between Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus had always been arranged, through the kind of escalating criminal activity that reliably produced a response from the wall crawler, like a frequency broadcast on a channel that only one receiver was tuned to. Otto moved through the preparation with a methodical calm that his deteriorating body made increasingly difficult to maintain outwardly, his mechanical arms doing more and more of the work of simply keeping him upright and functional, compensating for the tremors and the moments of dizziness that the neurological damage was now producing with enough regularity that he could no longer pretend they were anomalies. He was aware, during these final weeks of preparation, of how he must have appeared to anyone observing him, the diminishment visible in ways that would once have been unthinkable, the great Dr. Octopus reduced by his own biology to something that resembled, more than he would ever have acknowledged, a very sick man trying to finish something important before he ran out of time. Spider-Man came, as he always came, and the battle that followed was real enough in its physical dimensions, genuine conflict with genuine stakes, though Otto's primary objective was not victory in the conventional sense, but the establishment of the specific conditions that the transfer required. He needed contact. He needed a moment of sufficient neural proximity that the technology he had built into a device concealed within his costume could complete its function, bridging the gap between his mind and Peter's with enough precision to accomplish what no one had ever accomplished before. The fighting provided cover for the maneuvering, and the maneuvering achieved what it needed to achieve. And in a moment that lasted no longer than the span of a breath, something passed between them that changed everything that would follow. Peter Parker woke in a body that was not his own, and the wrongness of it was immediate and total, the kind of wrongness that bypasses all intellectual processing and registers first in the body itself, in the way the air felt entering lungs that were the wrong size, in the weight and positioning of limbs that responded to his intentions, with a slight, terrible delay that told him, before he had formed a single coherent thought about what had happened, that something had gone profoundly and irreversibly wrong. He was in Otto's body. He was in a body that was failing, that was in pain in ways that had become so continuous and so comprehensive that the pain had stopped announcing itself as something unusual, and had simply become the ambient condition of existing within it, the way a person stops hearing a sound that has been present long enough. He understood this with a clarity that arrived faster than he would have wished, and with it came the understanding of what must have happened, and with that understanding came a fear that he had not felt since the early days of his heroic career. The fear not of a villain or a threat or a battle he might lose, but of something that had no solution he could immediately identify. Otto, meanwhile, was experiencing something so far beyond what he had anticipated that his considerable capacity for intellectual processing was temporarily overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming sensation. Peter Parker's body was extraordinary in ways that the data could not have fully prepared him for. The spider sense alone was staggering, an awareness of the surrounding environment that arrived not as information, but as something closer to a sixth sense pressing in from all directions simultaneously, humming with the positions and movements and potential threats presented by everything within its considerable range. The enhanced strength was present, but it was the enhanced perception that dominated those first moments, the world arriving with a vividness and a resolution that Otto's own senses, even before their recent deterioration, had never approached. He stood in Peter Parker's body in the immediate aftermath of the transfer and felt, beneath the triumph and the relief and the overwhelming flood of new sensory data, something that he did not examine closely, and that he would not have named honestly if he had. He felt alive in a way that he had not felt in years. Peter, in what had been Otto's body, was working through his situation with the focused determination that had always been his most reliable resource in circumstances where his other resources were insufficient. He catalogued what he had available to him, the mechanical arms which responded to his attempts to control them with a sluggishness that suggested the neural interface was calibrated to Otto's specific patterns rather than his own, the failing body with its catalogue of damage and pain, and his own mind, intact and working and already searching for the solution that had to exist somewhere in the problem he was facing. He was not willing to accept that this was permanent. He was not willing to accept that Otto had won in any final sense, because the acceptance of finality had never been something Peter Parker had been able to sustain for very long, regardless of how clearly the evidence supported it. But the evidence, in this case, was presenting itself with unusual insistence. The body he was in was not simply unwell in a temporary or treatable way. It was shutting down in the incremental, systematic fashion of a machine whose components had passed their operational limits. And the timeline that this suggested was not one that allowed for the kind of extended problem-solving that his situation required. He spent hours that he could not afford working through every approach he could conceive, every possible avenue back to his own body, every leverage point that might allow him to communicate what had happened to someone who could act on the information. The mechanical arms, once he had spent sufficient time attempting to work with the interface, began to respond more reliably, and this partial restoration of capability gave him the means to attempt what he needed to attempt. Otto, occupying Peter's life and Peter's relationships and Peter's responsibilities, with an immediacy that his planning had not fully accounted for, was simultaneously managing the practical demands of an existence far more socially complex than his own had been, and processing the ongoing reality of what he had done. He had taken a life. Not ended one, precisely, not yet, but taken one, removed a person from their own existence with the same comprehensive thoroughness as any more conventional form of harm, and the person he had taken it from was someone whose life turned out, on closer inspection, to contain considerably more that mattered than Otto's assessment of Peter Parker had previously acknowledged. There were people who loved Peter. Not abstractly, not because of what he represented, but in the particular, specific, daily way that people love someone who has been present in their life with warmth and consistency and genuine care. This was information that Otto received as data and filed away, not yet knowing what to do with it. The final encounter between the two of them, before everything resolved into its terrible conclusion, happened in the space between their minds, in that residual connection that the transfer had left open like a door not quite closed, through which Peter had found a way to press his awareness toward what had been his own body, and toward the mind that was now inhabiting it. What passed between them in that space was not conversation in the ordinary sense, not the exchange of words in sequence, but something more compressed and more honest than words generally allow. The transfer of understanding between two people who had spent decades in opposition, and who were, in this final encounter, stripped of most of the defences that opposition had allowed them to maintain. Peter showed Otto his memories, not selected memories, not the memories he would have chosen to share if choice had been fully available to him, but the memories that the connection surfaced, the ones that were most essentially and irreducibly himself, Uncle Ben's face in the moments before everything changed, the specific quality of Aunt May's voice when she called him by name. The sensation of swinging between buildings on a clear morning when the city was quiet and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only existed in the early hours, and woven through all of it. The persistent, unglamorous daily weight of responsibility carried not as a burden to be resented, but as the straightforward expression of who he had decided to be. Peter Parker had not been a hero because he had powers. He had been a hero because he had made a choice, over and over, across the entirety of his life, to be someone who used what he had in service of other people, regardless of the cost. Otto received these memories with a mind that had been shaped by entirely different experiences and that had developed entirely different conclusions about what life was for, and something happened in the receiving that he had not anticipated and that he could not immediately categorize or dismiss. Something in him recognized what he was being shown. Not in the sense of familiarity, but in the sense of understanding something true, the way a person can hear a piece of music for the first time and know, without being able to explain the knowing, that it is beautiful. Peter Parker died in Otto Octavius's body on a day that the city outside did not mark in any way. The sky neither more nor less grey than it had been the day before, the streets carrying on their ordinary business of movement and noise and the 10,000 small transactions that constitute a city's daily existence. He died having done everything he could with the time and the resources available to him, which was the only way Peter Parker had ever done anything, and the echo of that fact lingered in the connection between them for a moment after everything else had gone, present and then not present, like a light turned off in a room that had been so consistently illuminated that the darkness, when it came, was the most complete silence Otto Octavius had ever experienced. He stood alone in Peter Parker's body in the aftermath of that silence, and he understood, with the full force of an exceptionally capable mind that could no longer avoid what it was looking at, that he had not simply taken a life. He had taken the life of someone who had chosen every day to be extraordinary in ways that Otto had never understood and had therefore never valued, and that the body he now inhabited, with all its remarkable capabilities, was the least significant thing he had inherited. What he had inherited, whether he was prepared for it or not, was the question of what he was going to do next. The silence that followed Peter Parker's death did not last, because silence of that particular kind, the silence left by the absence of something that had been genuinely present, does not simply persist and fade the way ordinary quiet does. It leaves a shape. It occupies the space where the thing was with a fidelity that is almost structural, so that even after the immediate moment has passed and the mind has moved on to the practical demands of the life it now inhabits, the outline of what is missing remains, pressing against the edges of awareness with a persistence that cannot be fully explained by any of the rational frameworks available to a scientific mind. Otto discovered this in the days following the transfer, when he had expected to feel the clean, unencumbered clarity of a man who has solved his most significant problem and can now direct his full attention to the next phase of his plans. What he felt instead was more complicated and less manageable. A faint but continuous presence at the periphery of his consciousness that resembled, more than anything else he could compare it to, the sensation of being watched by someone standing just outside the range of vision, present enough to register but not quite present enough to confront directly. He dismissed it initially as the residual noise of the transfer process, the neural equivalent of the visual artifacts that sometimes persist after a bright light has been removed from the field of view. He told himself that it would fade as his mind settled into its new physical environment, that the strangeness of inhabiting a different body with its different sensory profile and different neurological architecture would resolve into familiarity given sufficient time, and that whatever atmospheric disturbance the transfer had created in the deeper registers of his consciousness would gradually quiet as the new arrangement established itself as simply the way things were. He was wrong about this, and the wrongness became apparent slowly enough that he was well into the experience before he had fully acknowledged what the experience actually was. Peter Parker had not entirely left. This was the fact, and it was a fact that Otto approached with the skepticism appropriate to a scientist confronting a claim that contradicts established understanding, testing it from multiple angles, looking for the alternative explanation that would make it unnecessary to accept the more extraordinary one. He considered the possibility that he was experiencing a psychological phenomenon, the mind's tendency to populate silence with familiar patterns, particularly patterns associated with strong emotional valence. The way that grief can make a person hear the voice of the lost in a crowded room. He considered the possibility that the transfer technology, which had never been tested under actual conditions before its single and definitive use, had left traces of Peter's neural patterns embedded in the biological hardware of the brain he was now occupying, patterns that were activating in response to certain stimuli without constituting anything that could meaningfully be called a presence or a consciousness. These were reasonable explanations, and he held on to them for as long as holding on to them was intellectually sustainable, which turned out to be less long than he would have preferred. What persuaded him, finally, that the presence was real in some sense that exceeded mere neural artifact was its specificity. The echo of Peter Parker did not manifest as a diffuse atmospheric quality, a general tone of conscience or moral weight pressing uniformly across all of Otto's thinking. It manifested in particular moments, in response to particular choices, with a consistency and a precision that suggested something more purposeful than random activation of residual patterns. When Otto moved through a situation that Peter would have recognized, a moment requiring the specific kind of moral navigation that had characterized Peter's approach to his heroic responsibilities, the presence intensified, becoming less a background hum and more a distinct quality of attention, as though something was watching what he did with a focused interest that random neural noise could not account for. It was most present in the early days, when Otto was still learning the texture of Peter's life and making the kinds of decisions that revealed, cumulatively, what kind of person he intended to be in the circumstances he now occupied. Each time he responded to a situation in a way that Peter would have recognized as consistent with his own values, the presence settled, something in it becoming quieter, more at rest. Each time Otto responded in ways that were recognizably his own, the old calculating contempt, the reflexive dismissal of other people's interests in favor of his own, the presence sharpened, became more distinct, as though the contrast itself was a form of communication. He did not speak to it, not at first. Speaking to a presence that he had not yet fully acknowledged as real would have required a concession that his scientific training resisted, and beyond the scientific training was something more personal. The admission that Peter Parker was still here, in some form, was also the admission that what Otto had done had not been as complete or as clean as the plan had required it to be. He had intended to replace Peter Parker entirely, to inhabit not just his body but his life, to become the person who lived in that apartment and knew those people and swung through that city with no remainder, no residue, no ghost in the machine to complicate the occupation. The presence was evidence that intention and outcome had diverged, and Otto had spent enough of his life dealing with experiments that produced unexpected results to know that the appropriate response was not to pretend the data was not there. So he began, gradually and with the reluctance of someone making a concession under duress, to pay attention to it. Not to engage with it directly, not initially, but to notice it, to track the conditions under which it intensified or quieted, to build a picture of what it was responding to with the same methodical observational rigor that he brought to any phenomenon worth understanding. And what the picture revealed, assembled across weeks of careful attention, was a portrait of a conscience, not his own, which he had always experienced as a relatively minor inconvenience in the architecture of his decision-making, but Peter Parker's, which turned out to be something of an entirely different order. Peter's conscience, as Otto came to understand it through its echo, was not a list of rules or a system of prohibitions. It was not the negative space of things forbidden, the thou shalt not structure that most people, in Otto's observation, experienced as the primary form of their moral sense. It was something more active than that, more positively oriented, organized around a question rather than a boundary. What is the right thing to do here? Not in the abstract, but in this specific situation, for these specific people, given everything that is actually true about the circumstances. The echo of it pressed this question into Otto's awareness, at the moments when it was most relevant, not with the force of compulsion, but with the quality of a reminder, the way a person might leave a note in a place where they know it will be found. He found this when he allowed himself to think about it honestly, simultaneously irritating and unexpectedly useful. The irritation was straightforward. He had not invited a passenger, had not designed the transfer to produce a shared occupancy, and the presence of Peter's residual consciousness in the architecture of a mind he had intended to have, entirely to himself, felt like a violation of his own plan, an imprecision in the execution that offended his professional standards. The usefulness was more complicated to acknowledge, because acknowledging it required him to admit that there were situations in Peter Parker's life that Otto Octavius was not, on his own, fully equipped to navigate, situations in which the question of what the right thing to do was not one that his own moral history had prepared him to answer well. There was also, beneath the irritation, and beneath the acknowledgement of usefulness, something that Otto spent considerable energy not examining, something that had no clean name in the vocabulary he had developed for his own inner life. The presence of Peter's echo meant that Peter was not entirely gone, and the not entirely goneness of Peter Parker produced in Otto a response that he could not categorize as simply negative. He had wanted to defeat Peter Parker. Had wanted, in the deepest and least admissible layer of his wanting, for Peter Parker to know that he had been defeated, to be present for the acknowledgement of Otto's ultimate victory. The echo was not that, was not the presence of a defeated enemy forced to witness his conqueror's triumph. But it was a form of the continued connection between them that had defined Otto's sense of himself for decades, and the continued connection, even in this strange and attenuated form, was not nothing. The philosophical questions that the echo raised were ones that Otto, to his own surprise, found himself returning to in the quieter hours of his new existence. What constituted identity at the level that mattered? He was Otto Octavius, unmistakably and completely, in every register of thought and memory and fundamental orientation toward the world. He was also occupying a body that had been shaped by decades of Peter Parker's experience, a nervous system that carried the imprint of everything Peter had done with it, a brain whose physical structure bore the marks of a life lived in ways very different from Otto's own. The self that moved through the world in Peter Parker's body was not a simple thing, not a single occupancy with a clear owner, but something more layered and more strange than the straightforward displacement he'd planned. And somewhere in that layered strangeness, Peter Parker's echo persisted, not as a ghost in the haunting sense, not as a voice or a vision or a presence that announced itself dramatically, but as a quality of attention, a residual conscience, a faint but continuous signal that said, when Otto was paying enough attention to receive it, this is what it felt like to choose to be good. This is the specific texture of the decision, made again and again across an entire life, to use what you have in service of other people. This is what that costs, and this is what it feels like, and this is, in the end, what it amounts to. Otto could not silence it. He had tried, in the early days, applying the same disciplined suppression to it that he applied to other inconvenient inputs. And it had not responded to suppression the way inconvenient inputs normally did. It did not fade under sustained inattention. It did not yield to the intellectual argument that it was not real in any sense that obligated him to take it seriously. It simply continued, patient and specific and precise, doing what conscience does when it's genuine, which is to remain present regardless of whether its presence is welcome. He had taken Peter Parker's life, and Peter Parker, in the only form still available to him, had decided to remain anyway. What Otto did with that fact, what it eventually cost him, and what it eventually produced in him, was a story that was only just beginning to unfold. The life that Otto Octavius had taken possession of turned out, on close inspection, to be considerably more demanding than the life he had been living, and not primarily in the ways he had anticipated. He had prepared for the physical dimensions of being Spider-Man, had studied Peter's fighting style and patrol patterns and web-shooting mechanics with the thorough attention that he brought to any technical challenge, and he had prepared for the professional dimensions of being Peter Parker, the freelance photography, the scientific work at Horizon Labs, the academic history that he intended to expand upon with the doctoral degree that Peter had left unfinished. What he had not adequately prepared for, because his own life had contained so little of it, that he lacked the experiential vocabulary to anticipate its complexity, was the relational dimension, the dense and continuous web of human connection that Peter Parker had spent his entire life building and maintaining, and that now required Otto's daily attention in ways that no amount of technical preparation had equipped him to manage. The apartment on which he now paid rent was the first education. It was modest in a way that surprised him, not because he had expected Peter to live in luxury. He had known perfectly well that Peter Parker's finances were perpetually strained, but because the modesty of the space had a particular quality to it that his own Spartan living arrangements had never possessed. Peter's apartment was modest in the way of someone who had made peace with modest circumstances, rather than merely enduring them, someone who had arranged the available space with enough care and enough personal investment that it felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. There were books on the shelves that had been read rather than displayed. There were photographs on the surfaces, Aunt May at various ages, friends at occasions Otto could not yet identify, a life documented in the casual, affectionate way of someone who valued the people in it. The kitchen contained evidence of actual cooking, actual meals prepared and shared, a domestic practice that Otto had long since abandoned in favour of whatever was most efficient and least distracting from his work. He moved through the apartment in those first days with the careful, observational attention of a scientist examining an unfamiliar environment, cataloguing details, building a picture of the person whose life he was now required to inhabit convincingly. The picture that assembled itself was more layered and more sympathetic than the one he had carried in his mind through decades of opposition. The portrait of Peter Parker that Otto had constructed from the outside, from the evidence of their battles and the intelligence he had gathered over the years, had emphasized the qualities that were most relevant to understanding him as an opponent: his resourcefulness, his stubbornness, his moral inflexibility, the particular combination of guilt and responsibility that drove him past the limits that most people would have recognized as sensible stopping points. The portrait that the apartment offered was of someone whose interior life was richer and more varied than his exterior circumstances suggested, someone who had maintained warmth and humour and genuine human connection across years of stress and loss and the extraordinary daily burden of his secret life. The first visit from Aunt May arrived before Otto had fully established his footing in the new existence, and it constituted, without any question, the most disorienting experience of his early tenure in Peter Parker's life. He had known, in the abstract, that May Parker was an important figure in Peter's world, that the relationship between them was one of the central organising facts of Peter's emotional life, that she represented continuity and warmth, and the particular kind of unconditional love that had sustained him through his worst periods. What the abstract knowledge had not conveyed, and what no amount of preparation could have conveyed, was what it actually felt like to be in a room with May Parker and have her look at him with the specific quality of attention that she brought to the person she believed was her nephew. She was a small woman, who had become smaller with age, carrying herself with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to be thoughtful about how they move through space, but whose fundamental warmth expressed itself in her face and her voice, and the particular way she had of focusing entirely on the person she was talking to, as though that person were, in the moment of her attention, the most important thing in her world. She came bearing food, as she apparently always did, a casserole in a dish that had clearly been used for this purpose many times before, and she set it on the counter and turned to look at him with eyes that were sharp beneath their warmth, observant in the way of someone who has spent decades paying careful attention to a person they love and has developed, over that time, a finely calibrated sensitivity to the difference between that person's ordinary states and the variations from those states that might indicate a cause for concern. Otto felt the weight of that attention, and understood, with a clarity that arrived slightly before he was prepared for it, that maintaining his deception with May Parker was going to require a quality of performance that he had not previously had to sustain. She was not looking for lies. She was not suspicious, had no reason to be suspicious, had every reason to expect that the person standing in front of her was the person she had known since his infancy, and had raised through his childhood and had loved without reservation or condition across the entirety of his life. But her familiarity with Peter was so complete, so accumulated through so many years of close and attentive observation, that any deviation from the pattern she expected registered in her awareness, even if it did not immediately produce a conscious concern. He was careful. He had always been capable of patience when patience served his purposes, and the performance required here was one he approached with the full application of his considerable intelligence, attending to the specific rhythms of May Parker's conversational style, responding to the warmth she extended with what he hoped was a convincing approximation of Peter's characteristic blend of affection and gentle humour, accepting the casserole with what he calculated was the appropriate level of gratitude, not effusive enough to seem unusual, not so restrained as to suggest indifference to a gesture that he already understood was an expression of love rather than simply an act of food delivery. She stayed for an hour, and the hour was among the most concentrated social performances of his life, and when she left and he was alone again in the apartment with the casserole on the counter, he stood very still for a long moment processing what had just occurred. What had occurred beneath the surface of the performance was something he had not expected and was not certain how to categorize. May Parker had treated him with a kindness so uncomplicated and so freely given that it had produced in him a response that he could not immediately explain in any of the terms available to his usual emotional vocabulary. She had asked about his health, with a specificity of concern that indicated she had been thinking about him between visits, had noticed small things about his recent behaviour that suggested she was paying the kind of ongoing, low-level attention that constitutes one of the primary expressions of parental love, had touched his arm when she left in a gesture so natural and so unself-conscious that he had not been able to prevent it from landing with more force than a touch from a relative of a man he had replaced should reasonably have been able to carry. Peter's echo had been very present during her visit, not pressing or insistent, but simply attentive, as though the part of Peter that remained was aware of his aunt's proximity and found in that awareness something that warranted its full attention. Mary Jane presented a different kind of challenge. His relationship with her was more complicated from the outset, partly because the history between Peter and Mary Jane carried a weight and an intimacy that the simpler warmth of his relationship with Aunt May did not, and partly because Mary Jane Watson was, Otto came to understand fairly quickly, considerably more perceptive than the social persona she projected to the world might have suggested. She had spent years as Peter Parker's partner, had navigated the complexities of loving someone with a secret identity and extraordinary responsibilities, and the particular emotional patterns that came from a life shaped by loss and guilt and the daily practice of heroism, and that navigation had produced in her a sophisticated ability to read the person she knew against the person presenting themselves in any given moment. He was more guarded with her than with Aunt May, which was itself, he recognized, a potential tell, since Peter's relationship with Mary Jane had been characterized by a quality of ease and openness that guardedness would not fit. He managed it by calibrating the guardedness as something closer to distance, allowing her to interpret the change in his manner as a response to circumstances rather than a fundamental alteration of character, letting the complexity of recent events provide a plausible explanation for the ways in which the person she was talking to was not quite the person she remembered. She accepted this, or appeared to, with the grace of someone who had long since learned that loving Peter Parker required a certain tolerance for the inexplicable and the unexplained. But she watched him, and he was aware of being watched, and the awareness produced a secondary complication that he had not anticipated. He found himself, in the course of their interactions, genuinely interested in her. Not in the way that interested was a simple thing, not in the way of a straightforward attraction or a calculation about usefulness, but in the way that a genuinely exceptional mind produces interest when it encounters another genuinely exceptional mind operating in registers that are different from its own. Mary Jane's intelligence expressed itself in social and emotional domains that Otto had always undervalued because they were not his domains, and encountering it at close range, in the context of an ongoing relationship that required him to engage with it continuously rather than observe it from the distance of opposition, produced a reassessment that he had not been seeking, and that complicated his management of the situation in ways that were difficult to anticipate. The professional environment at Horizon Labs brought its own education. Peter Parker had been well regarded there, which was not a surprise since Peter's scientific abilities were genuine and considerable, but the specific quality of that regard was more nuanced than simple professional respect. His colleagues had liked him in the way of people who have spent enough time with someone to develop affection for the particular texture of their personality, their specific habits of thought and social interaction, the small, repeated behaviours that become, over time, the evidence of a consistent character. They had missed him during what they understood as a period of unusual behaviour and reduced availability, and their pleasure at his more regular presence was expressed in the ordinary social currencies of friendly workplaces, the small jokes and shared references and easy conversational shorthand that accumulate between people who spend significant amounts of time together over years. Otto navigated this environment with the particular combination of genuine competence and careful observation that had become his primary mode of operation in Peter's life. The scientific work was well within his abilities, better than within them since his own knowledge substantially exceeded Peter's in several relevant domains, though he was careful to perform at levels consistent with what Peter's colleagues would have expected, rather than revealing capabilities that would have prompted questions he was not prepared to answer. The social navigation was more effortful, requiring continuous attention to the patterns he was mapping, and a consistent performance of warmth and ease that did not come naturally to him, but that he was becoming, with practice, more accomplished at approximating. What he was not becoming more accomplished at, and what Peter's echo seemed to observe with particular attentiveness, was the spontaneous quality of Peter's kindness, the reflexive, unconsidered generosity that expressed itself in small acts throughout the day, the noticing of a colleague's difficulty and the immediate unplanned response to it, the quality of attention that Peter had given to the people around him that communicated, without any deliberate effort, that he saw them and considered their well-being worth his time. Otto could perform kindness when he thought about it, when the situation clearly called for it, and the performance served his purposes. What he could not perform was the quality of its arising in Peter, the fact that it had not been a performance at all, but simply the natural expression of someone who had organised his values around the question of what other people needed and had practiced the answering of that question long enough that it had become instinct. This was what the apartment and Aunt May and Mary Jane and the colleagues at Horizon Labs were all, in their different ways, showing him. That Peter Parker's life had a texture that could not be replicated through intelligence and preparation alone, because the texture was the product of decades of choices made in accordance with values that Otto did not share, choices that had built, incrementally and without any grand design, a life in which people felt genuinely cared for and genuinely seen. He could occupy the structure of that life. He could maintain its external dimensions with sufficient skill that most of the people in it would not detect the substitution. But the structure and the life it had been were not the same thing, and the difference between them was precisely what Peter Parker's echo kept returning his attention to. Patient and specific and impossible to silence. Otto Octavius had taken the life of a genuinely good person, and the taking of it had placed him, for the first time in his own long and complicated life, in daily contact with the evidence of what genuine goodness actually looked like from the inside, and what it had built in the world that surrounded it, and what it would cost to try to be worthy of it. He was not yet trying, but he was, for the first time, beginning to understand what trying would require. The understanding of what trying would require did not immediately translate into trying, because Otto Octavius had not spent the better part of a lifetime developing the habits of humility and selflessness that genuine trying would have demanded, and the gap between understanding a thing intellectually and embodying it in the daily texture of one's choices is one of the widest and most consistently underestimated gaps in human experience. What it translated into instead was something characteristically Otto, a decision to approach the project of being Spider-Man not as an exercise in becoming Peter Parker, which was both impossible and, in his assessment, unnecessary, but as an exercise in being a superior version of what Spider-Man could be, applying his own considerably greater intelligence and experience and ruthless pragmatism to a role that had, in his considered opinion, been consistently underperformed by its previous occupant. He called himself the superior Spider-Man. Not publicly, not in the way of an announcement or a declaration, but internally, as the organising principle of his approach to the work, the framework within which he made his decisions and measured his results. The name contained, as names chosen by Otto Octavius tended to contain, both a genuine belief and a considerable quantity of pride, and the genuine belief was not entirely without foundation. He was, by any objective measure, more intelligent than Peter Parker had been. His scientific knowledge was deeper and broader. His tactical thinking was more systematic. His willingness to make difficult decisions without the emotional interference that had always complicated Peter's approach to morally complex situations was, from a certain angle, a genuine operational advantage. He brought to the role of Spider-Man the capabilities of one of the most formidable minds the criminal world had ever had cause to fear, and he intended to use those capabilities to their fullest extent. The technological upgrades came first, because technology was the domain in which his superiority was most unambiguous and most immediately applicable. Peter's web shooters had been impressive pieces of engineering for devices designed by a teenage boy in a modest bedroom in Queens, but they had never been substantially improved upon across the decades of their use, refined and repaired, but not fundamentally reimagined, constrained by Peter's tendency to address immediate problems rather than step back and redesign systems from first principles. Otto redesigned them from first principles within the first weeks of his occupation of Peter's life, producing a more sophisticated mechanism that allowed for a wider range of web configurations, greater tensile strength, more precise delivery, and longer operational duration before requiring the replacement of web cartridges. He made similar improvements to the costume's lenses, enhancing their sensory capabilities, adding display overlays that integrated information from external sources in real time, transforming what had been a relatively simple protective covering into something approaching a sophisticated information processing system. The Spiderbots were his most ambitious technological contribution, and the one in which his particular genius expressed itself most clearly. The concept was straightforward in the way that the best concepts are straightforward. A network of small autonomous surveillance devices distributed throughout New York City, each capable of independent movement and basic threat assessment, all feeding information to a central processing system that he could access through the costume's integrated displays. The coverage they provided was extraordinary, extending Spider-Man's effective awareness across the entirety of the city, rather than limiting it to the range of his physical senses during any given patrol. Crimes that Peter would have stumbled upon by chance, or responded to after they had already occurred, could now be identified and addressed proactively, the Spiderbots flagging developing situations with enough advance notice to allow for planned, efficient intervention rather than reactive improvisation. He was proud of the Spiderbot network, genuinely and perhaps excessively proud, in the way that creators are proud of work that represents a genuine advance on what existed before. It was elegant and it was effective, and it demonstrated in concrete and measurable terms that his approach to the responsibilities of Spider-Man was producing results that Peter's approach had not achieved. The reduction in response times was significant. The increase in successful criminal apprehensions was documented. The ability to coordinate across multiple simultaneous incidents, directing his attention where it was most needed rather than being constrained to whatever happened to be within range of his senses at any given moment, represented a qualitative improvement in Spider-Man's effectiveness that he felt entirely justified in regarding as evidence that his methods were working. What the metrics did not capture, because metrics are not designed to capture such things, was the change in the quality of Spider-Man's presence in the city, the subtle but accumulating shift in how the hero felt to the people he encountered, both those he was helping and those he was opposing. Peter Parker's Spider-Man had always carried with him a quality of genuine human warmth, expressed through his humour and his visible concern for the people in the situations he entered, that communicated something important about the nature of his heroism, that it was personal, that it arose from genuine care rather than abstract principle, that the person behind the mask was someone who actually saw the people he was protecting and was affected by their well-being. Otto's Spider-Man was effective, was often more efficiently effective than Peter had been, but it was effective in the way of a very good machine, with a quality of professional competence that left the people it helped feeling safe but not necessarily seen. The shift was subtle enough in the early months that it produced only diffuse discomfort rather than specific concern, the kind of atmospheric change that people register without being able to articulate what has changed or why it matters. Spider-Man was stopping more crimes. Spider-Man was responding faster and deploying more sophisticated strategies. Spider-Man was, by the available measures, performing better than he had in recent memory. And yet, something was different in a way that the people who knew him, who had worked alongside him or been helped by him across years of his presence in the city, felt without being able to fully name. The heroes noticed first, as they tended to, because the people most sensitive to changes in a known quantity are the people whose own safety has depended at various points on their accurate reading of that quantity. The Avengers, with whom Peter had developed the kind of working relationships that form between people who have faced genuine danger together and emerged from it with their mutual regard intact, were the most relevant audience for the changes Otto was producing, and their responses ranged from unease to active concern depending on their proximity to and history with the person they believed was Spider-Man. Some of them interpreted the changes as the product of circumstances, the ordinary shifts in behaviour that come from periods of stress or significant life change, extending the benefit of the doubt in the way that people tend to extend it to those they have worked alongside and learned to trust. Others were less easily reassured. The behavioural changes were too consistent, too systematic, too suggestive of a fundamental rather than circumstantial shift in values, and approached to be explained away as the temporary effects of difficult circumstances. Thor, whose understanding of people was rooted in millennia of experience with the full range of what people were capable of, observed the new Spider-Man with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to take seriously the evidence of his own instincts, even when that evidence resists articulation. And what his instincts told him was that the quality of the person behind the familiar mask had changed in ways that went deeper than mood or stress, or the adjustments that ordinary life events produced. He said relatively little about this observation initially, in the careful way of someone who understands the consequences of a wrong accusation. But his attention remained focused in a way that would eventually matter. The situations in which Otto's approach produced outcomes that Peter's would not have produced were instructive in what they revealed about the difference between the two philosophies of heroism that were now in competition. There was the matter of the Vulture's young accomplices, children who had been recruited into criminal activity by a man who should have known better, whom Otto encountered during one of his more efficient criminal apprehensions, and whose youth he found insufficient reason to moderate the methods he applied to their situation. Peter would have responded to those children with an instinctive recognition of their vulnerability and a corresponding adjustment of his approach, understanding that the most important intervention in such situations was not punishment, but the provision of a different possibility. Otto processed their youth as a data point rather than as something that should materially change the weight of his response, and the result was an outcome that was technically a resolution of the immediate criminal situation, and also a small, quiet cruelty that the children involved would carry with them long after the situation itself was over. There was the matter of Massacre, a villain whose capacity for indiscriminate violence made him, in Otto's considered assessment, a threat that the justice system's approach to rehabilitation was inadequate to contain. Peter had always maintained, against the evidence of repeated recidivism and the genuine danger that certain of his enemies represented to innocent people, a commitment to the principle that his role was apprehension rather than judgment, that the line between hero and something more troubling was located precisely at the point where the person with the power to make permanent decisions began making them unilaterally. Otto did not locate the line in the same place, and in the case of Massacre, he demonstrated this clearly enough that the demonstration produced ripples of concern across the network of heroes who had worked alongside Spider-Man and who understood, from experience, where his limits had always been. Peter's echo was very present in the aftermath of those decisions, not frantic or accusatory, but with a quality of sustained attention that felt, in Otto's increasingly honest assessment of what the presence actually was, less like judgment and more like grief, the specific grief of someone watching something they had built and cared for being handled in ways that did not honour what it was. He processed this observation and set it aside because setting things aside had always been his primary method of dealing with information that complicated his preferred account of a situation, and the work continued, and the Spider-Bots continued their surveillance of the city, and the crime statistics continued to trend in favourable directions, and the superior Spider-Man continued to be, by every measurable standard, more effective than the one who had preceded him. Jonah Jameson, whose long campaign against Spider-Man had been one of the more reliable features of the New York media landscape for decades, found himself in the peculiar position of a critic whose primary target had shifted in ways that made sustained criticism less straightforward. The new Spider-Man's methods were more aggressive, more willing to employ force and to produce outcomes that satisfied the punitive instinct that Jameson's editorials had always appealed to in their audience. This should, by the logic of his previous positions, have been an improvement, the vigilante finally exhibiting the accountability and decisive action that Jameson had argued the situation required. Instead, it produced a discomfort that Jameson expressed with the blunt directness that was his primary mode of communication. Something was wrong. Something about the person wearing the costume had changed in ways that he could not identify, but that his journalist instincts, honed across decades of covering the city's strangest stories, would not allow him to dismiss. He was not wrong. He was simply looking at the evidence available to him and reaching the correct conclusion with the tools he had, which is the most that can be asked of anyone. The superior Spider-Man was performing admirably by the metrics, and poorly by the measures that metrics could not reach, and the gap between those two assessments was precisely the gap between what Otto had understood about heroism when he began, and what he would eventually, at considerable cost, come to understand about it later. For now, the spider-bots hummed across the city, and the patrols ran on schedule, and the arrest numbers were impressive, and the superior Spider-Man continued his work with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that effectiveness is the primary virtue, and that the texture of how effectiveness is achieved is a secondary consideration, that sentiment has elevated beyond its actual importance. Peter's echo continued its patient, attentive presence at the edges of his awareness, noting what was gained by this approach, and noting, with equal and unhurried specificity, what was being lost. The efficiency that defined Otto's approach to Spider-Man's responsibilities extended with characteristic comprehensiveness to the other dimensions of Peter Parker's life that he had decided required improvement, and among these the matter of Peter's unfinished doctorate occupied a place of particular significance in Otto's hierarchy of things that needed to be addressed. It was not, on the surface, the most urgent of the various loose ends he had inherited. The city's criminal landscape presented more immediate demands, and the social performances required to maintain Peter's relationships consumed considerable ongoing attention. But the unfinished degree nagged at him in a way that the other inheritances did not, with the specific irritation of someone who has encountered an incomplete piece of work and finds the incompleteness offensive regardless of whether the completion serves any immediate practical purpose. Peter Parker had possessed the intellectual capacity to finish a doctorate and had not finished it, and while Otto understood the circumstances that had prevented the completion, the understanding did not diminish the offence. He enrolled at Empire State University with the intention of correcting this, driven by a motivation that was, as so many of his motivations were, simultaneously genuine and thoroughly entangled with his own need to impose order and excellence on whatever environment he occupied. The doctoral program in physical chemistry to which he attached himself was rigorous in the way of serious academic programs, demanding both in the depth of knowledge it required and in the quality of thinking it expected from its candidates, and Otto found it rigorous in the way that a person finds rigorous a challenge that is genuinely at or near the edge of their capability. It was not at the edge of his capability. It was comfortably within it, which meant that the primary challenge of the program for him was not intellectual but social and performative, the management of his presence in an academic environment in a way that was consistent with the person his fellow students and supervisors expected Peter Parker to be, rather than the person he actually was. He was, as he had become in all the contexts that Peter's life required him to navigate, careful and observant and more attentive to the texture of other people's expectations than he had ever previously found it necessary to be. It was in this context, in the seminar rooms and laboratories and common areas of Empire State University's chemistry department, that he first encountered Anna Maria Marconi, and the encounter produced in him a response that he was not expecting, and that took him considerably longer than his usual processing speed to accurately identify. She was a doctoral candidate in the same program, working on a thesis concerned with the synthesis of novel pharmaceutical compounds, and she was introduced to him at the beginning of the semester with the casual brevity of academic introductions, a name and a research area and a handshake, and something in the handshake and the direct appraising quality of her gaze registered in Otto's awareness with a distinctness that he noted and then set aside, because he had things to accomplish, and the noting of impressions was not, in his experience, a productive use of the attention required for accomplishing them. She was small, moving through the world with a self-possession that communicated a long familiarity with the experience of being underestimated, and a complete equanimity about it, as though she had decided at some point that other people's failure to accurately assess her was their limitation rather than her problem, and had organized her energy accordingly. He encountered her again in the laboratory, and again in the small seminar that met weekly to discuss research in progress, and in both of these contexts she demonstrated a quality of scientific thinking that produced in him the particular form of attention that he reserved for things genuinely worth attending to. She was precise without being narrow, creative within rigorous constraints, capable of following an argument to its conclusion without losing the thread of its assumptions, and willing to disagree with established positions when her analysis of the evidence gave her grounds to do so, which it regularly did, and which she demonstrated without the apologetic hedging that many graduate students employed when challenging received wisdom. She disagreed with him twice in the seminar during the first 3 weeks of the semester, and both times she was correct, and both times she stated her correction with a directness that acknowledged no hierarchy of expertise between them beyond the hierarchy that the quality of the argument itself should establish. He found this extraordinary. Not the correctness, which he was accustomed to encountering, and could assess without difficulty, but the manner of it, the complete absence of the social calculation that most people applied when disagreeing with someone they perceived as more experienced or more senior. She was not performing fearlessness. She was simply, as far as he could determine, not particularly afraid, which was a quality so uncommon in his experience of other people that encountering it in a graduate student in a seminar he had joined primarily to finish an incomplete degree produced a recalibration of his attention that he had not planned for and that resisted his subsequent attempts to return it to its previous allocation. Their collaboration on a section of related research began as the natural convergence of adjacent interests and expanded, over the weeks that followed, into something more sustained and more mutually engaging than either of them had initially proposed. Working with Anna Maria was an experience unlike the collaborative work that Otto had conducted throughout his professional life, which had always been characterized by a fundamental asymmetry in which he was the primary intelligence and his collaborators were, to varying degrees, instruments of his own thinking. Working with Anna Maria was something closer to genuine intellectual partnership, in which the outcome of the thinking they did together was different from, and in several ways superior to what either of them would have produced independently, a phenomenon that Otto found simultaneously gratifying and vaguely unsettling, since it required the acknowledgement that his own thinking had limits that someone else's thinking could productively address. The conversations that developed between them in the margins of their research, the exchanges that began as methodological discussions and gradually expanded to include wider questions of scientific philosophy, and the ethics of research and the relationship between intellectual ambition and the responsible application of knowledge, were among the most genuinely stimulating conversations Otto had experienced in years. He was careful, as he was careful in all of Peter's relationships, but the carefulness in Anna Maria's case carried a different quality than it did elsewhere, less the performance of someone maintaining a cover, and more the thoughtfulness of someone who was aware that the situation required honesty about certain things, and who was working out, in real time, what honesty was available to him. He could not be honest with her about who he was. That was the limit, fixed and immovable, the one truth that the maintenance of his existence required he withhold from everyone in Peter Parker's life, regardless of the quality of the relationship developing around it. But within that limit, in the conversations that did not approach that particular boundary, he found that he was increasingly inclined toward a form of honesty that his previous relationships had never drawn from him, sharing his actual assessments rather than calculated versions of them, expressing disagreement rather than managing the interaction toward a predetermined conclusion, being, in the specific and limited sense that his circumstances permitted, something closer to genuinely present than he typically allowed himself to be with anyone. The quality of her attention to him was something he had not anticipated needing to account for. She was perceptive in the way that scientifically rigorous people are perceptive, accustomed to looking carefully at what is actually there rather than what is expected to be there, and what she was looking at when she looked at him was not the performance of Peter Parker that he was maintaining for the rest of the world, but something that seemed, in her observation of it, more specific and more complicated than the performance was designed to present. She did not say this directly. She did not have the contextual information that would have allowed her to name what she was noticing, and he was careful enough that what she was noticing did not resolve into anything that would have given her grounds for specific concern. But she saw, in the person she believed was Peter Parker, a quality of internal complexity that she found interesting, and her interest expressed itself in the continued, deepening quality of her engagement with him, an engagement that did not reduce or simplify over time but became instead more nuanced as it accumulated more information. He began, without having made a deliberate decision to do so, to look forward to seeing her. Not in the way of a plan or a strategy, not as something identified and then pursued, but in the way that anticipation arises when the prospect of a particular experience has become associated, through sufficient repetition and sufficient quality of that experience, with something genuinely good. The laboratory sessions and the seminar discussions and the coffee conversations that had grown up around the research, these things had become, in the architecture of his days, the moments toward which other moments oriented themselves, and the recognition of this, when it finally surfaced clearly enough to be recognized, produced a stillness in him that was very different from the controlled composure he maintained in all his other interactions. Peter's echo was quiet during the time he spent with Anna Maria, quieter than at almost any other point in the daily existence he was now living. It was not absent. The attentiveness that he had come to recognize as its characteristic quality was still present, but it had a different texture in these moments, something less like observation and more like the specific peace that comes when things are, however briefly and however imperfectly, as they should be. He was aware of this, and could not entirely account for it, except to note that whatever the echo was responding to in his interactions with Anna Maria, it was responding to it with something closer to recognition than to concern. The ethical dimensions of the situation were ones he was capable of identifying clearly, even if he was not yet prepared to allow that clarity to materially alter his behaviour. He was in a relationship with a person who did not know who he was, whose feelings for him, whatever they were and wherever they were developing, were feelings for a person who did not exist in the form she understood him to exist in. The dishonesty embedded in every exchange between them was not the minor social dishonesty of maintained privacy or selective disclosure, but something more fundamental, a misrepresentation of identity so complete that the question of what remained genuine in the connection, despite it was one that he could approach only with considerable intellectual discomfort. He had taken a man's life and was now, in that man's name, beginning to experience something that felt, in its early and tentative development, like the possibility of love. What love meant to Otto Octavius was not a question he had spent much time examining, because the examination of such questions had always seemed to him the indulgence of people who had insufficient intellectual problems to occupy them. His previous relationships had been characterized by the dynamics of control and need rather than by genuine mutual regard, and he had not, until Anna Maria, encountered someone whose presence in his life consistently produced something other than the desire to manage or possess or demonstrate superiority. She did not want to be managed, and was not available to be possessed, and had demonstrated with characteristic directness that she found demonstrations of superiority both boring and slightly rude, and the combination of these qualities had produced in Otto Octavius something genuinely unprecedented, the experience of wanting to be worthy of someone rather than simply wanting to have them. He did not know yet what to do with this wanting. He did not know whether it would survive the recognition of everything it was built on, and everything it was therefore, in some important sense, not. What he knew, sitting in the seminar room in the late afternoon light while Anna Maria made an argument about catalytic mechanisms with the focused precision that characterized everything she did, was that something in him that had been organized for most of his life around the acquisition of power and the defeat of enemies had oriented itself quietly and without announcement towards something entirely different, and that this reorientation was, whatever else it was, entirely real. While Otto moved through the quieter dimensions of Peter Parker's life with the careful attention of someone learning, however reluctantly and however incompletely, what it meant to be genuinely present for another person, the city that Spider-Man was sworn to protect was developing a problem of extraordinary proportions in the places where his surveillance did not reach, in the underground spaces and the shadow networks, and the carefully maintained invisibility of an operation so patient and so methodically constructed that its existence constituted in itself a kind of rebuke to the philosophy of heroism that Otto had been so confident in implementing. The Goblin Nation was not a sudden emergence. It was a revelation, the surfacing of something that had been building for a long time beneath the architecture of a city that believed it understood its own criminal landscape, assembled with a precision and a strategic intelligence that matched in its own domain the precision and strategic intelligence that Otto had brought to his occupation of Peter's life. The Green Goblin had always been, across his various incarnations and across the long and painful history that the identity carried in relation to Spider-Man, something more than a conventional criminal, The original bearer of that name had been a man of genuine and formidable intelligence, whose madness had organized itself not around simple greed or the desire for power in the ordinary sense, but around a need for dominance that was absolute and comprehensive, a need to establish, beyond any possibility of dispute, that he was superior to every other force operating in his environment. That need, translated into criminal strategy, had produced schemes of unusual ambition and unusual patience, schemes that operated on multiple timelines simultaneously, and that used misdirection not as a tactic, but as a structural principle, building visible threats that drew attention toward themselves while the actual work proceeded in the spaces that attention had been drawn away from. The Goblin King who had assembled the network beneath New York City had learned from that legacy, had taken its essential strategic intelligence and applied it with an updated understanding of the city's vulnerabilities and an updated set of tools for exploiting them. The network had grown incrementally, the way that genuinely dangerous things grow when they are given sufficient time and sufficient protection from scrutiny, adding nodes and resources and personnel through processes so gradual and so carefully camouflaged within the ordinary criminal activity of the city that no single piece of it, observed in isolation, would have suggested the scale of what the pieces together constituted. Petty criminals brought into the fold through the promise of protection and resources. Safe houses established in the city's underground infrastructure. In tunnels and maintenance corridors and the forgotten spaces beneath streets that the city's official maps did not fully account for. Communications networks running through channels that did not intersect with the ones that Otto's spider bots were monitoring not by accident but by design, because the person building the network understood the nature of the surveillance that Spider-Man had established and had organized the network's communications specifically to avoid it. This was the central and most damaging irony of Otto's methodical approach to heroism, the very comprehensiveness of his surveillance, the Spider-Bot network that he had deployed with such pride and such confidence in its ability to provide him with complete situational awareness across the city, had a structural vulnerability that a sufficiently intelligent adversary could identify and exploit. The Spider-Bots monitored the city's visible surfaces, its streets and rooftops and public spaces, and the criminal activity that expressed itself in those environments. They did not monitor what they could not reach, the deeper infrastructure, the private channels, the patient accumulation of resources and relationships that constituted the Goblin Nation's actual operational foundation, and the Goblin King had understood this before Otto had finished deploying the network, had factored it into a strategic plan that treated the Spider-Bots not as a threat to be countered, but as a distraction to be exploited, drawing Spider-Man's attention toward the crimes that the bots could detect, while the genuinely significant work proceeded beneath that attention's effective range. Otto became aware of the network's existence gradually, and with a reluctance that contained, though he would not have named it as such, the discomfort of someone recognizing that a situation has been developing in ways that their confidence in their own methods had made it difficult for them to detect. The intelligence arrived in fragments, small inconsistencies in the criminal landscape that the Spider-Bots were mapping, patterns that did not resolve into any of the familiar shapes of organized criminal activity, but that accumulated when viewed collectively rather than individually, into the suggestion of something operating at a scale, and with a coherence that the visible data did not fully explain. Someone was coordinating activity in the city's underworld with a sophistication that the individual criminal actors involved did not on their own possess. And the coordination was happening through channels that Otto's surveillance was not reaching. He increased the density of the Spider-Bot network in the areas where the anomalies were most concentrated, deploying additional units to fill the gaps that the original deployment had left, and this expansion provided more data without providing substantially more clarity, because the gaps the expansion was designed to fill were not gaps of coverage in the spatial sense, but gaps of a different kind, gaps produced by the deliberate structuring of the Goblin Nation's communications and operations to avoid exactly the kind of technological surveillance that Otto had built. He was, in a way that he found genuinely frustrating, looking in the right places with the right instruments, and still not finding what he was looking for, because what he was looking for had been organized specifically to remain invisible to those instruments. The personal dimension of the threat took shape slowly, the way that personal dimensions of external threats take shape, when the external threat is being conducted by someone with sufficient intelligence and sufficient knowledge of their target to understand where the target's personal vulnerabilities actually reside. The Goblin King had access to information about Spider-Man's activities and relationships that went beyond what the public record could have provided, information suggesting a level of research and observation that should have been impossible given the security measures Otto had implemented, but that was, in practice, less impossible than it should have been because the Goblin King's understanding of how to gather intelligence on a target included methods that Otto's security protocols had not fully anticipated. The surveillance of Aunt May came to Otto's attention through a spider bot that detected unusual observation of her movements in the neighbourhood, a pattern of attention that was subtle enough to have been missed in the ordinary monitoring of the area, but that, once flagged, resolved clearly into the shape of deliberate targeting. Someone was watching Aunt May in the careful, patient way of people who are establishing patterns of behaviour rather than preparing an immediate action, learning her routines, mapping the geography of her daily life, building the kind of operational knowledge of a target that precedes the moment when that target becomes useful. The discovery produced in Otto a response that surprised him with its immediacy and its force, a sharp focusing of attention that was not the measured strategic concern of someone managing a threat to a protected asset, but something more personal, more urgent, more directly connected to the specific weight that May Parker had acquired in his experience of the life he was living. He adjusted the surveillance coverage around her with an efficiency that reflected both his technical capabilities and the urgency the situation had generated in him, adding layers of monitoring that would detect any approach to her before it could develop into direct contact, installing protections in her environment that she would not be aware of and that would have been difficult for most adversaries to circumvent. He did this with the focused attention that danger to a valued person produces, and in the doing of it he understood something about Peter Parker's heroism that the months of occupying Peter's life had been gradually teaching him, without his having previously reached the explicit articulation of it. The motivation that made heroism sustainable across years of difficulty and loss and personal cost was not abstract principle. It was not the intellectual commitment to the idea of protecting innocent people as a general category. It was this, the specific fear for this specific person, the sharply felt recognition that something that mattered to him personally was in danger, the mobilization of everything he had in response to that recognition. Peter had known this for his entire heroic career, had organized his life around the protection of the people he loved, had carried the weight of that protection as both a burden and a source of the motivation that got him back up every time he was knocked down. Otto had observed this from the outside and had assessed it as a vulnerability. The sentimental attachment to individuals that complicated rational strategic thinking and created exploitable leverage points for enemies who understood how to use personal connections against a hero. He had not understood, until May Parker's safety became something he was genuinely afraid of losing rather than simply obligated to maintain, that the vulnerability and the strength were the same thing, that the attachment which created the exploitable leverage also created the specific quality of determination that could not be manufactured by any other means. Anna Maria's potential exposure to the Goblin Nation's attention arrived in the intelligence shortly after the discovery of the surveillance on May Parker, and the response it produced in Otto was even more immediate and even less amenable to the measured strategic framing that he preferred to apply to operational threats. The possibility that the Goblin King's network had identified Anna Maria as someone connected to Spider-Man and was considering her as a potential point of pressure hit him with a force that bypassed his usual processing speed entirely, arriving not as information to be analysed but as something closer to the physical sensation that people describe when they speak of the fear that belongs specifically to the potential loss of someone irreplaceable. He understood, in that moment, and with the clarity that certain moments produce, that his feelings for Anna Maria had moved beyond the interesting and the unprecedented and the complicated into something that he recognised, for all his inexperience with it and all his discomfort with the recognition, as love. The Goblin King's identity, which Otto had been working to establish through the intelligence gathered by his expanded surveillance network, remained partially obscured behind layers of misdirection that reflected a sophisticated understanding of how investigative processes worked and where their blind spots were. What he could determine was that the person coordinating the Goblin Nation had a history with Spider-Man that predated Otto's occupation of the role, that their grievances were personal in a way that went beyond the ordinary criminal antagonism that most of Spider-Man's enemies brought to their opposition, and that their knowledge of Spider-Man's world, his relationships and his patterns, and the geography of his personal life was the kind of knowledge that came from sustained, close, historically grounded observation rather than recent research. The city above the Goblin Nation's underground infrastructure continued its ordinary life, unaware of the scale of what was being assembled beneath it, and Otto continued his patrols with the Spider-Bots, feeding him their continuous stream of surface-level data, and the gap between what the data showed and what was actually happening grew incrementally wider with each passing week. And somewhere in the tunnels and shadow networks below the streets, the Goblin King continued his patient work, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has planned for a long time and has no reason to rush the arrival of the moment they have been planning toward. Peter's echo was present throughout this period, with a quality that Otto was beginning to be able to read with some precision, and what it communicated in the specific texture of its attentiveness during these weeks of accumulating threat and personal fear was not commentary on his strategic failures or his methodological blind spots, though those were real and would eventually demand accounting. What it communicated was recognition, the recognition of someone who had lived in this experience many times before, who understood from the inside what it felt like to be the person that a city's safety depended on, and to feel, beneath the competence and the determination and the genuine commitment to doing the work, the very human fear of not being enough, of the people who mattered being in danger that even the best available effort might not be sufficient to prevent. Otto had spent months believing that Peter Parker's heroism had been a less effective version of what he himself could provide. He was beginning, in the cold quiet of the recognition, that the Goblin Nation represented a failure of his own system and a threat to the people he had come to care about, to understand that what Peter had possessed was not a less effective version of Otto's approach, but a genuinely different thing, rooted in sources that Otto had not yet fully accessed, and organised around purposes that his own formidable capabilities, deployed in service of his own formidable pride, had not been adequate to serve. The threat was real, and it was growing, and it was personal in ways he had not anticipated, and the hero who needed to meet it was still, in too many ways that were about to matter enormously, more Otto Octavius than he was Spider-Man. And so let the story settle now, like the city settling into the quiet hours after midnight, when the lights soften and the streets grow still, and the weight of everything that happened during the day finds its resting place in the darkness. What we have followed tonight is not simply the story of a villain who wore a hero's mask. It is the story of what happens when a person is placed, by whatever strange turn of circumstance or fate, in contact with the evidence of genuine goodness, and cannot look away. It is the story of a conscience that refused to be silenced, of love arriving in the places where pride had made a person believe love was unnecessary, of the slow and difficult and entirely real transformation that becomes possible when someone chooses, even once, even imperfectly, to put another person's well-being above their own certainty. These are not stories that belong only to heroes and villains. They belong to every person who has ever reconsidered something they were certain of, who has ever been changed by another person's kindness, who has ever found, in the wreckage of a plan that did not go as intended, something truer and more valuable than the plan itself contained. Rest now. Let the web grow still. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, let your body find its stillness, and allow the cares of the day to drift away like smoke on a cool evening breeze. Tonight we're going to travel somewhere ancient and vast, not to a city of steel and glass, but to a realm of gold and shadow, of deep magic and older grief, where the gods themselves were not so different from the rest of us in the ways that mattered most. This is the story of Loki, not the monster that legends made of him, not the villain that fear required, but the whole complicated soul beneath the performance, the brilliant, restless, heartbroken being who spent an eternity searching for the place where he truly belonged and found it finally in the most unexpected way imaginable. There is no need to hold tightly to every detail tonight. Simply let the story carry you, the way deep water carries something gently placed upon its surface. Rest now and listen. Before Loki, there was light, air. Not the tentative, apologetic light of early morning, but the full, confident radiance of a realm that had existed long enough to believe in its own permanence. Asgard rose from the void of space not as something constructed, but as something that had simply decided to be. Towers of pale gold catching the eternal sun at angles that made the entire city seem to glow from within, as though the stones themselves remembered warmth and chose to keep it. The streets were wide and worn smooth by centuries of use, lined with the kinds of trees that grow only where time has been generous, their roots so deep and their canopies so broad that they had become as much a part of the architecture as the buildings themselves. The air smelled of metal and rain and something green and wild that came from the distant forest beyond the city walls, and in the quieter hours of the Asgardian day, when the training grounds were still and the great halls had not yet filled with the noise of evening, you could hear that wildness breathing at the edges of everything civilized. It was a kingdom that had earned its confidence. Thousands of years of history had shaped Asgard into something genuinely formidable, not merely powerful in the way that a sword is powerful, but powerful in the way that a river is powerful, capable of both sustaining and destroying, depending on what it chose to do with itself in any given moment. The Allfather Odin had ruled it for longer than most of its inhabitants could fully comprehend, his reign stretching back to an era when the 9 realms were still sorting out the terms of their relationships with one another, when alliances were made in blood, and the distances between worlds were crossed by warriors who did not always come home. He had seen empires rise in the lesser realms and collapse back into the earth. He had watched civilizations make the same mistakes in different costumes over and over, with the particular patience of someone who understood that wisdom could not be given, but only accumulated slowly, through the repeated experience of being wrong. Odin was not a simple man, if man was even the right word for what he was. His face in those years before everything changed carried the specific expression of someone who has spent a very long time thinking about a very complicated problem without arriving at a solution that satisfies him completely. The single eye that remained to him, the other sacrificed long ago in exchange for something he considered worth the cost, held a quality of attention that could be uncomfortable to receive directly, as though it were seeing not just the surface of things but the entire depth behind them. He was not unkind. He was in fact capable of great and genuine tenderness, particularly in the private hours when the requirements of kingship had been set aside for the evening, and he sat beside Frigga in the quiet of their shared rooms, talking about nothing in particular in the easy way of people who have run out of secrets and found the absence of them peaceful. Frigga was, in many ways, the more interesting sovereign. She held no formal throne, occupied no official role that the histories would rush to record, and yet Asgard without her would have been a fundamentally different place, sharper, colder, more efficient in the way that things are efficient when they have been stripped of their warmth. She was a practitioner of Seda, the deep and subtle magic of foresight and transformation that Asgardian culture had never quite decided how to categorize, too powerful to dismiss, too feminine in its character to fully celebrate in a warrior civilization, too useful in practice to abandon. Frigga used it the way she used everything, quietly, precisely, and in service of the people she loved. She had a gift for understanding what someone needed before they had found the language to express it themselves, and she extended that understanding without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement in return. To be loved by Frigga was to be seen entirely and still chosen, which is perhaps the most generous form that love can take. Their son Thor arrived into this world like the thing he would one day embody, loudly, with great energy, and accompanied by a sense of occasion that made everyone in the vicinity feel that something significant had just occurred. He was a golden child in the most literal sense, fair-haired and broad-shouldered even in early youth, possessed of a physical confidence that seemed less like arrogance than simple accuracy. He was in fact stronger than almost everyone around him, faster, more capable of absorbing punishment and returning it, and he knew this the way a tree knows it is tall, not as a boast, but as an ordinary fact about the nature of things. The Asgardians adored him with the wholehearted enthusiasm of people recognizing their own ideal reflected back at them in living form. He was brave, he was generous with his laughter, he was loyal to his companions beyond the point that strategy would recommend, and he had the particular gift of making everyone in his immediate vicinity feel that the world was fundamentally manageable, that its problems could be addressed with sufficient will and sufficient strength, that the future was a place worth moving toward with confidence. He was also, in these early years, somewhat limited in his understanding of the things that could not be lifted or fought. This was not a criticism but an observation. He had been given every tool he needed to be the warrior and king that Asgard required, and he had applied himself to developing those tools with genuine dedication. The subtler arts, patience, doubt, the willingness to sit with a question longer than was comfortable, rather than reaching for the nearest available answer, these would come later, paid for in the usual currency of suffering and loss. In the meantime, he was magnificent, and Asgard was glad of him, and he moved through his youth like someone who has never seriously considered the possibility that the world might not accommodate them. It was into this world, complete, confident, already furnished with its golden air, that Odin brought something small and cold from the frozen battlefields of Jotunheim. The war with the frost giants had ended in the way that wars between cosmic powers tend to end, not with the clean resolution of a decisive victory, but with an arrangement that satisfied no one entirely and committed everyone to a precarious stability. Jotunheim was vast and ancient and deeply strange, a world of perpetual cold where the indigenous giants lived at scales that made ordinary contact with them a disorienting experience, where the landscape itself seemed to participate in the hostility of its inhabitants. The conflict had been brutal and prolonged, and Odin had prevailed in it through a combination of military force and the particular ruthlessness that he wore lightly but carried always, the willingness to do what was necessary, even when what was necessary was genuinely terrible, in service of the larger peace. On the last day of the war, moving through the ruins of a Jotun temple in the frozen dark, Odin had found an infant. He had been left on a stone altar in the heart of the temple, placed with the deliberate care that suggests an act not of abandonment but of offering, or perhaps of strategic sacrifice, the leaving behind of something inconvenient in hopes that circumstances would resolve the inconvenience without requiring direct action. The child was small, far smaller than any frost giant infant should have been, which was already an anomaly that spoke to something unusual in his origins. He had gone silent in the cold, his breathing shallow and his colour the pale blue-grey of deep ice, and he watched the approaching figure of the Allfather with eyes that were at that moment the red of Jotun blood, and would not remain that colour for very long. Odin stood and looked at this child for a long time. What he thought in those moments, he never fully explained to anyone, including the child himself, and that silence would cost them both more than either of them could have anticipated. Perhaps he saw a political opportunity, a frost giant prince raised as Asgardian, a living bridge between the realms, an instrument of future diplomacy. Perhaps he saw something of himself in the specific quality of the child's aloneness, an echo of his own early experiences of isolation and necessity. Perhaps, in some wordless way that the rational mind would have been embarrassed to acknowledge, he simply could not leave a living thing to die on a stone altar in the dark when he had the power to prevent it. He lifted the child. The blue skin shifted immediately at his touch, responding to Asgardian warmth or to some deeper magic that Odin carried within him, transforming through a ripple of subtle colour until it was the pale tone of Asgardian skin. The red eyes faded to a clear and startling green. The child, who had been silent and still, made a small sound. Not quite distress, not quite comfort, but something suspended between them, which was perhaps an appropriate beginning. Odin carried him home across the sky, through the machinery of the Bifrost, back to the golden light of Asgard, where Frigga was waiting and the realm continued in its confidence, unaware that something had just arrived that would one day shake it to its foundations and in doing so, reveal what it was truly made of. The child had no name yet. He would be given one that meant nothing to him by birth and everything to him by experience, and he would spend the better part of eternity deciding what he thought about the difference. The child who arrived in Asgard with no name and no history was given both within the first days of his new life, and neither of them told the complete truth about what he was. He became Loki Odinson, Prince of Asgard, second son of the Allfather and the Queen, who had been waiting in the golden light when his new father carried him home. Frigga received him with the particular calm of someone who had already decided before the arrival what her answer would be. She held him with the confidence of a woman who understood that love was not a feeling that preceded commitment, but a practice that followed from it, and she began that practice immediately, completely, in the way that would define their relationship for as long as both of them existed. Loki grew in Asgard the way a plant grows in soil that is mostly but not entirely right for it, reaching toward the light with genuine eagerness, putting down roots that held, producing something real and living and in many ways beautiful, while somewhere beneath the surface, in ways that would not become visible for a long time, something about the fit was not quite perfect. This was not anyone's fault in the simple sense of that phrase. Frigga loved him without reservation. Odin provided for him with the full resources of a king's capacity. Thor, older by enough years to occupy a different world but young enough to be genuinely delighted by a brother, welcomed him with the open-handed warmth that was already his most characteristic quality. The household was not cold, the household was not cruel. And yet, the earliest memories that Loki would have been able to describe, if anyone had thought to ask him while they were still forming, were not memories of grand events or significant occasions, but of textures and atmospheres, the specific quality of the light in the palace library in the late afternoon, when it came through the high windows at an angle that turned the dust motes in the air into something almost ceremonial, and the shelves of accumulated knowledge receded into a comfortable dimness that felt like being held. He spent more time in that library than anywhere else from very early in his childhood. Not because anyone directed him there, but because the library asked nothing of him that he could not provide. The books did not require him to be stronger or louder or more demonstrably present than he naturally was. They simply offered themselves, and he accepted, and the transaction was clean and uncomplicated in a way that few of his other interactions in those early years managed to be. He was a quiet child in the way that certain kinds of highly active minds produce quiet children, the stillness on the surface concealing an interior that was in constant rapid motion, processing and sorting and connecting, building elaborate structures of understanding from whatever materials were available. He watched people the way a scientist watches an experiment, with genuine interest and careful attention, and the specific patience that comes from believing the data will eventually yield something meaningful if you simply observe long enough without disturbing the conditions. Adults found this quality alternately charming and unsettling depending on their own comfort with being observed, and the children who became his earliest companions tended to be the ones who were secure enough in themselves not to find his attention threatening. Thor, by contrast, was already the sun around which everything else in their immediate world oriented itself. This was not an exaggeration, or a retrospective distortion produced by later events. It was simply the accurate description of a personality so large and so genuinely luminous that proximity to it changed the character of whatever surrounded it. Where Loki was still, Thor was in motion. Where Loki spoke carefully and precisely, Thor spoke with the exuberant imprecision of someone who trusted that his meaning would be received regardless of how exactly it was packaged. Where Loki made friends through the slow accumulation of demonstrated reliability, Thor made them in moments, through the force of a smile or a shared laugh, or the generous willingness to simply be delighted by another person's existence. They loved each other. This is the important thing to hold on to through everything that comes later. They loved each other genuinely, in the specific way of children who grow up sharing the same corridors, and the same meals, and the same occasional reprimands from the same parents, who know each other's habits and fears and embarrassing preferences before either of them has developed the sophistication to curate what they reveal. There was nothing performed about it in those years. Thor would find Loki in the library and sit beside him for hours without needing to understand what he was reading, content simply in the company. Loki would watch Thor's training sessions from the gallery above the practice yard with the combination of genuine admiration and private analytical attention that was already his signature way of being interested in something, appreciating the spectacle while simultaneously cataloguing its mechanics. When they quarrelled, which they did with the frequency and intensity of children who are closely enough bonded to genuinely infuriate each other, the quarrels resolved quickly, leaving no lasting residue, because neither of them had yet learned to hold grievances across time. The differences between them were visible early, but in those years they functioned as complementary rather than divisive. Asgard had room, in principle, for both the warrior and the scholar, the hammer and the mind, the son who would command armies and the son who would understand things that armies could not address. There was a version of their shared childhood in which these differences produced a genuine and lasting partnership, in which the realm they would eventually inherit was made stronger by having both of them at its centre. That version existed as a possibility for a long time before events conspired to foreclose it, and the sadness of Loki's story is inseparable from the awareness that the better version was always available, always just slightly out of reach. The training that Asgardian princes received began early and covered a comprehensive range of disciplines, from physical combat through diplomatic history through the theoretical foundations of magic and cosmology. Loki engaged with all of it, but with a selectivity that became apparent fairly quickly to anyone paying close attention. He was competent with weapons, more than competent, genuinely skilled, with the particular precision that comes from approaching physical training analytically rather than instinctively. But he was not Thor. He would never be Thor in the ways that the instructors who stood at the front of the training halls most valued, and some of them communicated this, not cruelly but thoughtlessly, in the small accumulated ways that thoughtlessness communicates itself. The comparison was never quite stated directly. It did not need to be. It was present in every moment when Thor's performance produced immediate enthusiastic acknowledgement, and Loki's equally fine performance produced something more measured, more qualified, more prefaced with what he was not before arriving at what he was. What he was, in those early years of magical study, was extraordinary. Frigga recognized it first because Frigga had the gift of recognizing things that had not yet announced themselves, and because she was already watching him with the particular quality of attention that she gave to things she loved and wanted to understand. The day she offered to teach him the deeper disciplines of Seda herself, rather than leaving his education to the court instructors, who handled it as a minor supplement to physical training. Loki was perhaps 8 or 9 years old in the reckoning that Asgardians used for their children, and he looked at her with an expression that contained, in its mixture of hope and careful restraint, the entire emotional vocabulary of a child who has learned not to expect too much from good news before it has been fully confirmed. She taught him every afternoon in her private rooms, where the light was different from the library light, warmer, more deliberate, filtered through hangings of deep colour that she had chosen herself over many years. She was a patient teacher with high standards, which is the best combination, and she had the wisdom to understand that Loki's intelligence required a specific kind of engagement. Not simplification, but precision. Not encouragement alone, but genuine challenge. Not the protection of his confidence through easy success, but the building of real capability through honest difficulty. He flourished under this approach with the undisguised relief of someone who has finally been given the appropriate tools for a task they have been attempting with the wrong ones. Magic, in Loki's hands, seemed less like something he had learned, and more like something he had remembered. The foundations of illusion work that took other students months to master, he absorbed in days. Not because he was rushing, but because the underlying principles seemed obvious to him in the way that certain kinds of knowledge are obvious to the mind shaped to receive them. He could hold an illusion stable for longer than students years his senior, could layer them with a complexity that produced images indistinguishable from reality, could feel the construction of them with a precision that allowed him to make adjustments no one else could detect. Frigga watched this and said nothing excessive about it, which was its own form of respect. She treated his gifts as facts rather than occasions for performance, which taught him to do the same. Transformation came next, and then perception. And then the subtler disciplines that did not have simple names. The arts of understanding the underlying structure of things, of reading the intentions and emotional states of others with an accuracy that went beyond ordinary intuition, of being present in a space without disturbing it, of moving through the world in ways that left fewer traces than ordinary movement. He learned all of it with the deep satisfaction of someone whose education has finally caught up with their capacity, and the afternoons with Frigga became the fixed point around which the rest of his days organised themselves. Outside those afternoons, he was still navigating the more complex social geography of a childhood, lived in the shadow of a brother who occupied so much of the available light. He was not without friends. He had companions who valued his intelligence, his dry and precise humour, his reliability in a crisis, his ability to plan several steps further ahead than anyone else in whatever group he found himself part of. But these friendships had a quality that was subtly different from the easy, warm, physical camaraderie that surrounded Thor wherever he went. They were more considered, more deliberate, more dependent on the specific compatibility of the individuals involved, which made them in some ways deeper and in other ways more fragile. The mischief began in this period, and it is worth understanding what it actually was before the later years gave it a darker colouring in retrospect. It was not malice, it was restlessness, the overflow of a mind operating well above the capacity of its daily requirements, seeking stimulation and experiment, and the specific pleasure of watching a cleverly constructed situation unfold according to its internal logic. The schemes were small and inventive, and occasionally inconvenient for their targets, but they had the quality of puzzles rather than attacks, the quality of a craftsman testing the properties of materials rather than someone with a grievance to express. He was interested in what people would do under unexpected conditions. He was interested in the gap between how things appeared and how they actually were. He was interested in the mechanics of surprise, the architecture of the moment when reality declines to behave as expected. Thor found most of this genuinely funny, which mattered more than Loki could easily have said. There is a particular kind of confirmation that laughter provides, the confirmation that someone sees you clearly and is not frightened by what they see. And Thor's laughter at Loki's schemes, offered without hesitation, and without the qualifying nervousness that some of the others showed, was one of the consistent sources of uncomplicated warmth in Loki's childhood. They got into trouble together. They stood in front of Odin together and received the consequences of their adventures with the specific solidarity of children who have agreed in advance that the shared experience is worth the shared cost. In those moments of minor transgression and mutual accountability, they were simply brothers, without the weight of destiny or difference, and the simplicity of it was something Loki would carry with him for a very long time. But the simplicity had limits that became more apparent as they grew older, and the world began to organize itself more insistently around the question of what they would each become. Thor's future was clear and celebrated. The warrior king, the golden heir, the continuation of everything that Asgard understood itself to be. Loki's future was less legible, to others and to himself, and the illegibility of it produced in him a quality of watchfulness that was something more than his natural observational habit. He was watching for information. He was watching for evidence of where exactly he fit in the story that Asgard was telling itself about its own future, and the evidence was not always reassuring. He was loved. He was genuinely, substantially loved by his mother completely, by his brother in the complicated, wholehearted way of someone who loves without always understanding, by his father in ways that Odin's emotional reticence made difficult to receive as clearly as they were meant. He was loved, and he was valued, and he was, in some way that he could feel, but not yet name, not quite in the place the story had been built for him to occupy. The fit was real. The fit was also, in some register below conscious awareness, slightly off, a note that was almost right, almost exactly what the music required, but carrying within it a frequency that the ear of someone paying close attention could hear as something other than perfect. He did not know yet what that frequency meant. He would not know for a long time. But it was there, woven into the texture of his childhood like a thread of a different colour, running through cloth that is otherwise consistent, invisible unless you were looking for it. Unmistakable once you had learned to see, the thread of difference that ran through Loki's childhood became, as he grew older, increasingly legible as something specific. Not a deficiency, not a wound, but a particular kind of orientation toward the world that expressed itself most completely in the practice of magic, and that revealed, in its full development, an intelligence shaped for questions that Asgard did not always know how to ask. Magic in Asgard occupied a complicated position. It was real, it was powerful, it was woven into the foundations of the realm's history and the deepest practices of its most revered figures. And yet the culture that had grown up around warrior virtue and physical conquest had never quite resolved its relationship with the arts that operated through subtlety rather than force, through perception rather than impact, through the patient manipulation of hidden structures rather than the direct application of overwhelming strength. Cider was respected in the abstract and quietly condescended to in practice, acknowledged as necessary and simultaneously treated as something that real warriors supplemented their abilities with, rather than centered their identities around. It was Frigga's domain, and Frigga was loved, but the love Asgard extended to her had always contained within it a trace of the particular condescension that powerful cultures extend to the things they depend on but do not fully understand. Loki understood this dynamic before he had words for it, in the way that children who pay close attention to adults understand the gap between what adults say and what they mean. He watched how the court responded to demonstrations of physical power and how it responded to demonstrations of magical precision, and he noted the difference in the quality of the attention. The first received with the immediate, uncomplicated admiration that Asgardians reserved for things that confirmed their self-image. The second received with something more reserved, more qualified, more tinged with the slight discomfort of encountering excellence in a domain one has not entirely decided to value. He filed this information away without immediately knowing what to do with it, which was his characteristic response to information that had not yet found its context. What he could do, by the time he was moving through the middle years of his Asgardian education, was genuinely remarkable by any honest measure. The illusions he constructed had achieved a complexity that went well beyond anything the court instructors had expected from a student his age. Not merely visual representations, but fully sensory environments, complete with sound and texture and the subtle atmospheric details that distinguish a lived space from a painted backdrop. He could populate these illusions with figures that moved and spoke and responded with enough apparent independence that even careful observers sometimes required extended examination to identify the artifice. The craft demanded by this level of construction was immense. The sustained concentration, the simultaneous management of multiple independent elements, the constant fine adjustment required to keep the whole coherent as conditions changed around it. He made it look effortless, which was itself a kind of additional skill, the skill of concealing the labour within the product. Frigga watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who has had the rare experience of encountering a student whose development exceeds the bounds of what the curriculum was designed to produce, and who must decide in real time how to continue serving that development. She expanded her teaching accordingly, moving into territories of magical theory and practice that she had not initially intended to cover for years yet, following Loki's capacity rather than her original plan, trusting that the plan existed to serve the student rather than the other way around. Their afternoons lengthened. The conversations that accompanied the practical work became increasingly philosophical, ranging across questions about the nature of reality and perception, about what it meant to change the appearance of something versus changing its substance, about the relationship between the world as it was observed and the world as it actually existed beneath observation. These conversations were among the most nourishing experiences of Loki's young life, and the nourishment they provided was of a specific kind, the kind that comes from being taken seriously by someone whose seriousness you respect. From having your questions treated as genuinely interesting rather than merely precocious, from discovering that the things you find most compelling about existence are things that another person finds equally compelling and has spent far longer thinking about. Frigga was not a simple woman, and she did not offer Loki a simple education. She offered him the real thing, with all its difficulty and ambiguity intact, and he received it with a gratitude that he could not always express directly, but that was present in everything about the quality of his attention when he was with her. The transformations he learned to work upon himself came later than the illusory arts, and they came harder, which surprised him initially given how naturally everything else had developed. To change the appearance of an external object, or to construct an image from nothing, required a certain kind of outward-directed attention, a projection of will and imagination into the space outside the self. To change oneself was a different operation entirely. It required turning that same precise attention inward, toward the very instrument that was doing the attending, which produced a kind of recursive complexity that even Loki's unusually ordered mind found genuinely challenging. There was also something else in the difficulty, something that Frigga recognized but waited for him to identify himself, which he eventually did with the specific quality of reluctance that surrounds true perceptions. To transform himself, he had to be willing to look at himself clearly first, to know, with precision, what he was actually working with before he could decide what to change it into. And looking at himself clearly required a sustained honesty about his own nature that was, even at this relatively young age, not entirely comfortable. He was good at observing others with accuracy and without flinching. Turning that same unflinching accuracy on himself was a skill that would take him considerably longer to develop, and that he would spend much of his life finding ways to avoid the necessity of. But the transformations, once he began to master them, opened something in him that the illusory arts had gestured toward without fully reaching. There was a freedom in them that he had not anticipated, not the freedom of escape exactly, but something more nuanced, the freedom of discovering that identity was not as fixed as it appeared to be, that the boundaries of the self were more permeable than the culture around him generally acknowledged, that what you are was in some